Thanks for having me. Thank you for coming to see me. I'm here, and my friend Claire and I are going to talk about the lost redemption of Judas Iscariot. We all know that just before Jesus' crucifixion, he was betrayed by two. Peter, who denied the Lord 3 times, was, of course, restored in given time, but not Judas. The end of Judas' story is told in the Gospels and retold in Acts. And I'm going to begin by reading 2 of those selections. In Matthew, Judas tries to return the money, the 30 silver pieces. "I have sinned," he said, "for I have betrayed innocent blood." And the priests reply, "What is that to us? That's your responsibility." So Judas threw the money into the temple and he left. Then he went away and he hanged himself. We know the chief priests picked up the coins, decided they could not take the money, and so they bought a potter's field. They used it as a burial place, and it's been called the Field of Blood ever since. Then again in Acts, we get a little more detail. With the payment Judas received for his wickedness, he bought a field, and there he fell headlong. His body burst open, and all his intestines spilled out. Everyone in Jerusalem heard about this, and so they called that field in their language the Field of Blood. So it's this potter's field that has always captured me. Judas cast himself into that potter's field. Let me share a little bit about what's become of potter's fields. We have a small one started here. Of course, I'll add to it, don't worry. They've long been used to bury anonymous, poor outcasts. For as long as there have been potter communities, they've also been used for potters to cast their fragments into. Now, potters keep them and boat builders keep them, these humble piles. They're piles of missteps meant to remind us of the delicateness and the tenuousness of the work that we do. As a potter, I've long contemplated those things which get cast upon this heap. You see, the process of creating a vessel, even a simple vessel, is complex. And as a new potter, you get warned constantly, don't hold too tightly to the work. It could fall at any moment. It could collapse at any time. The steps are many to creating a vessel. First, I massage the air trapped in the clay body. Then I center the clay on the wheel, aligning the molecules. I lift walls. I trim edges, shoulders, feet. And then after all that, the drying begins. And this has to be timed carefully. The vessel must dry slowly but thoroughly, lest the moisture in it expand and push outwards in the kiln and explode the vessel. Finally dry, out of the first kiln, I glaze it and I put it back in the kiln, hoping that it doesn't touch its neighbor or slump again against too much or too little heat. So many small steps, so many places to fail. You have to see that at any moment, this vessel may collapse. It may shatter, it may fall to the floor, it may melt, it may kiss its neighbor, and they fall together. Judas Iscariot is one of those vessels, shattered, cast aside into the potter's field. And often when I sit in front of the potter's wheel, I contemplate the fate of the broken vessel, the fate of the broken Judas. Is there room for redemption? Was there room for redemption in his story? And by extension in mine and yours? Yes, is the answer I've found. But only in working with clay have I found that answer to be yes. This is true the world over. For instance, the Japanese have a practice of mending broken ceramics with a gold lacquer, and it's this difficult, tedious process to mend. But inherent in this idea is that the vessel is more precious, having been broken, having been shattered and added to. Similarly, in the potter's field I keep in my yard, along with my own castaway shards, there are broken dishes that I dug up one summer from my yard. Someone 113 years in the making, my house was built in 1903, someone threw dishes into the yard to be buried and covered over with dirt. And then I dug them up one summer, and now they sit in my potter's field. And they are beautiful. They're in fact more beautiful than probably when they were whole. And they remind me that they are more beautiful because of turmoil, and by extension, we are more beautiful because of our turmoil. In talking with Claire Deering, who can come up now, she's my proverbial gold lacquer. She puts me together all the time. We have found the same truth in art. So I will turn it to her to talk.
There's something quite captivating about the breaking. I mean, everyone was talking and speaking, and then all of a sudden the room got quiet, and some people started to kind of maybe get uncomfortable, and some people's attention was immediately drawn towards this sound of shattering. And pain and suffering has a way of drawing our attention, especially if we're the one that's being broken, has a way of getting our attention and focusing us in a very powerful way. And sometimes in that process, people around us get uncomfortable in the way that it's playing out. And sometimes people are just kind of quietly watching the process. But there is something about the breaking that changes who we are. And even as Molly began to talk about Judas, when we started talking about this project, immediately my gut felt like, ooh, can we talk about redemption and Judas? He is like the one sort of figure in Scripture that is really reprehensible. And collectively, we kind of feel like, ooh, is there redemption even for Judas? Because we have a hierarchy, and when that brokenness happens, we have certain things that we're comfortable and certain things that we're not comfortable. And as we begin preparing to speak today, I'm going to read a piece that I've written that actually just is being published right now. But I came across this quote, and Zora Neale Hurston, I'm nervous, who of course wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God, just this profound woman, likely inspired by the Spirit, just wrote like numerous works in a short amount of time, just kept pouring out. This is a quote that I came across, and it's something that speaks to the time required of art and the time required of suffering, or at least certainly the redemption of that suffering. And she says, there are years that ask questions and years that answer. And I think if you would have talked to me in my early teens and in my 20s, I would have been quick to give you an answer about all things Christian, and I would have been very quick to have the right thing to say. But at 30, I found myself divorced, embarrassed, not measuring up to what my family had expected of me, certainly not finding a lot of grace within the church around me, and wondering, where do I go from this point? Where do I begin? The breaking, the very, very visible shattering, so that all could see. And slowly, as I began to kind of live in that space, waiting in that space, I started to write. And I had written a lot. I had written in undergrad, I had written in graduate school, I was an English major, I have degrees in English, so it wasn't that I hadn't written anything before, but I started to write in earnest. The bare bones, the pain, the wrestling with things that before had been completely taboo and off sort of off the shelf. We're not going to talk about those things. And here's the amazing thing that happened. As I started to write about those things, these words that I had tossed around for so long, grace, hope, security, I said them so flippantly, all of a sudden they took on this rooted meaning, this deep, intrinsic meaning. What does it mean to receive grace? What does it mean to be redeemed? What does it mean to have hope when your family isn't talking to you? What does that mean? And wow, the difference between my faith and my faith, remarkable. And without that waiting and that sorrow and that suffering, it would have been impossible to get from this to this. So that's some of the context. This is the piece that I was going to share with you. It's a flash fiction piece, and I'm sure you know that, but it's quite short, and in some ways, maybe it sounds like it lacks hope. But I think if I can say it this way, it's almost this picture or this symbol of shedding the old way of viewing the church community and this new, deeper level of faith. Okay, so this is catch and drag benediction. Picture a parcel of land straddling the edge of a hillside. Its eastern border woven so tightly to the rim, you might find yourself tiptoeing, nervous as hell, but one misstep and the soil will crumble beneath your feet. On this threadbare plot is a church, its architects taking quite literal the command to be a city upon a hill. There's a white steeple, sure, and orange stained glass, and a gravel rectangle for the station wagons. You've been there before. You know it well. But the thing that catches your eye on this visit is that swing set, rising from the earth like Haman's gallows. Just two rustic pillars with a cross beam nailed to the top. Too high to be store-bought, and missing all the entrapments of safety. No plastic tubing, no sanded corners. Dangling from the scaffolding, 3 pairs of chains sway without touch, moving before you can even finger their rust. It is the one relic from childhood that time refuses to dwarf. You could swing, you tell yourself, wedge your backside into that rubber cradle and pump those middle-aged legs without mercy. You could soar above the sanctuary windows towards the pitched roof that Mrs. Ayer's son, the one who mumbled and smelled like piss, jumped off of on a dare. You could float for an instant, waiting for the chain to catch and drag you back under. Who would know? The place is deserted. Empty as the tomb, your mother would say. You find it difficult these days to separate her voice from yours. Harder still to do it here. On your ascent, would you see her front row pew, where the faded blue carpet rubbed raw by arthritic knees? Maybe you would see nothing at all, just rotted wood and broken glass. A building subject to decay like bones and good intentions. So you run your naked palm over a splintered beam, knowing that pain is the closest thing that you'll come to bringing something tangible off this mountaintop. On a personal level, there's a remove from me and the narrator. There's still hope and faith. But the sorrow that has come, the time maybe specifically of all, most specific of all, the time in that has opened up a new level of empathy and awareness. I'm much slower to speak now when somebody asks for advice, or when somebody doesn't ask for advice and is suffering through something. I'm much slower to give out a platitude. I'm much more careful when I think I have the right answer for them. I'm a much better listener and waiter. And as we were talking about Judas as we were thinking through his story, he takes his own life. He jumps the gun, literally. He doesn't want to wait through the sorrow and the suffering, the shame of that betrayal. I can't even imagine. And Peter does, and at the end is fully restored. There's a deeper bond between him and Jesus. And the story of Judas, if we can learn something from him, in evading, in avoiding the sorrow and the suffering and the embarrassment, we don't see his redemption played out. If there is a lesson there, it's the power of time. That God's goodness is never too short to save, but often the healing and the restoration is a journey. And in writing, or in pottery, or in art, that time required, that waiting, the years that ask the questions and the years that answer, they don't come in an instant. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes.
So maybe a question for Molly.
Yes.
So Potter's Field means they, the community of people that they taught through their leftovers?
So they throw their leftovers, anything that breaks in the process goes in that pile, and then they have also historically been used to be a pauper's field.
So that anybody could just kind of hang out there?
Well, that's where they're buried. That's where often anonymous poor people end up
Yeah,
buried.
okay,
Yes.
no, I know that, but the concept of Potter's
Yes.
Field was, it was the
Yeah.
shards, the leftovers?
Mhm. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Molly, this question for you too. Have you made things, do you go back and revisit your potter's field in your backyard and ever actually craft new items out of those?
Such as mosaic.
Or, I
I'm not sure that I have. I do, so my potter's field is actually, it houses an iron fire pit. So I do often find myself on summer nights sitting in front of the fire and sorting the shards and picking out the ones that are especially beautiful or especially something. And I do find myself sorting them a lot. Other question? Go ahead.
I was thinking about when you guys were talking about Judas and how like isolating that grief is, and maybe just like, what did you do for in place of community, or if you had one? Because like in my experience, like grief can be very isolating, and it's hard to like when you talked about the concept of waiting, Peter waited and Judas didn't, and like, what did you? Yeah.
When you do well, wait.
Yeah, in your experience of
Yes.
grief and like waiting and not, and like that isolation, that I think both of them experienced, but maybe Peter sometimes like, what did you do? No, that's a vague question.
No, it's not a big question. I think it's the human heart condition. I think human nature and shame, right? We want to hide, so we close down and we put up the walls and we don't talk to anybody and we say everything's fine. And the reality is, and I think that's what's so powerful about writing, is you start to be more honest with the people around you. When I was going through this, Molly was a huge support in my life during that season. And I think that there's something marvelous about honesty, even if you're honest with yourself. Like, this is really bad. I hate this. To let yourself, even to acknowledge that before God. There's something very powerful about that he tends to bring community around you. And the beatitude that always sticks in my mind that I never really fully understood until more recently is, blessed are those who mourn. And it didn't make a lot of sense until I realized, like, well, you can't comfort someone who's not actually mourning. If somebody pretends like everything's fine and they're not in mourning, you're not gonna receive a whole lot of comfort, but in the vulnerability of like, mourning, I am a mess, which is so unlike Western culture. We go into cloistered like spaces to mourn. It's hard to receive comfort, but you'd be surprised when there's a vulnerability of mourning. I think the community comes, and I think God's faithful to bring it.